All right. Um, so we left off talking quite a bit about the concept of racialization, which the main examples are when you have a majority group who is trying to categorize another group based on their race, and usually that majority group will decide on things they don't like that they will categorize the other groups with, right? Some examples from the book. This image, well, the image is supposed to be of Spanish conquistadors torturing and killing indigenous populations, right? And well, depictions like this were backed up by the fact that there was a lot of this going on. On Friday, my plan is to watch the second episode of Guns, Germs, and Steel, because, well, the next chapter we're going into is going to be on politics, going to be a lot more about empires and colonialism, so we'll actually go into a lot of details about this. But this was actually part of a bit of a propaganda campaign by people like the British, who wanted to recruit people to, be settlers and colonists for them, trying to paint this discourse of the Spanish as being barbarians, right? So this type of demonization of other ethnicities, other groups, is nothing new, and this is the globalized version of it. There's lots of different ethnicities, lots of different places around the world who are marginalized. The book talks about the Ainu in Japan, who originally had a number of territories that are now, this is Russian territory. This is territory that Japan colonized. Japan, lots of other countries were big colonial powers outside of the traditional kind of Europeans that we talk about. Kurds in Turkey, I think we've talked a little bit about that. The Kurdish population, well, when these different countries were divided up in their different ways, usually by outside actors, they would split up ethnicities. So the Kurds are split up into a number of different countries. There's enough of a population that they could have, if they were their own country, it would be about the size of the other countries in the region. And the book also talks a bit about Christians and Muslims in Israel as persecuted minorities. Actually, I was going to say, when it comes to minority groups in Japan, have I already talked about this? People heard of the Yakuza, right? If you ever seen anything about Japan, like the gangsters, you ever hear about that? People will hear that term and they'll just think that it's regular Japanese people who become gangsters, but they're part of a minority population who were on this landmass before the Japanese took over what is now fully Japan. And very often, persecuted minorities in different countries, they won't get hired, right? And so they will often turn to crime because they gotta eat, right? And so that is, these groupings, you could use the examples of the Italian mafia in the U.S., right? For a good while, the Italians were also a persecuted minority in the U.S. Wouldn't be hired, people wouldn't kind of accept them, and so turn to ways to sustain yourself that are available if all others are taken away. A term in this chapter, anti-Semitism. It's probably a term you've heard of before. We talked about the old Jewish ghettos that were in Europe hundreds of years ago, and they still exist in that you could go visit them, and they have kind of mixed populations these days. But anti-Semitism, well, because Jewish populations have been in a lot of different countries that are not their ethnic homeland, if anything went wrong or anything happened in these countries and you have the power structure wants to blame someone, they would suddenly become, well, people would try to distribute information suggesting that they were secretly in control of worldwide events, when they're very clearly are not. They're not only were they a minority, but they were persecuted in all these different countries. And if you go back through time, you have famous examples like the Spanish Inquisition, when Spain had the Reconquista, as they say. Spain retook Iberia for Spain and forced people to convert. And the history of that is still on things like food choices in Spain itself. You haven't been to Spain? Well, maybe you'll get to study abroad someday. I recommend it. Wonderful place. But the cuisine there still very heavily leans on pork, and part of the reason of that is because, well, during the Spanish Inquisition, people were accused of not actually converting to Christianity, and so they would do things that they felt Islamic people wouldn't do. So they would eat extra pork and kind of show it off, right? And do these things and be like, look how not Muslim I am, kind of things. All right. There's a section here looking at genocide. This is, in geography, this is what we call an equal area projection map. Maps have all these different projections, meaning, well, because you're taking a round thing and making it flat, you got to make choices about what you're going to do. Most maps choose to have everything be the proper shape, but not size. So most maps, this is a map where everything compared to each other is the actual size that it is. And one of the reasons a lot of geographers are using this type of map more recently is because it really accurately identifies, well, places around the equator, and then the further equator you get on traditional maps have been squished in size, right? So places like Africa on maps that you would see most places, well, as you can see here, it's a huge landmass, a huge continent, right? All of Europe could just go in a little pocket of Africa. So during colonialism, sorry, these maps aren't the best. I had to scan them from books because I couldn't find maps that showed the things I wanted to show. But this map here on your left with the little white lines, those lines are the different ethnicities within Africa. As you can see, there's a great deal of them. And the colors are the different ways that the colonial Europeans divided up the country. And very often, and they talk about this very explicitly in their literature at the time, they very purposely wanted to divide up a number of different ethnicities. Kind of similar to the video we saw looking at the border here, that you have an indigenous group who was on that border area far before the border was put into place, right? But they'll be split up in these types of ways. Again, another map just showing the colonial territories. So as I was saying, the book talks about the Rwandan genocide, where up to 1 million people were massacred, and it's very tied to its colonial history. Within Rwanda, you had the Belgian colonial rule. When you look at the different European countries and their different methods of colonialism, the Belgians were kind of some of the more brutal. But when it comes to the genocide in Rwanda, well, historically, when the Belgians had control of the territory, and again, this is a place where they split up these different ethnicities, so these different ethnicities also lived in neighboring countries. Well, the Belgians liked the Tutsi, who were a minority of the population. You can see the Hutu population, 85% of the population. But the Belgians liked the Tutsis because they were taller and lighter complected, and thus, because they were thinking only in racial aspects, the Belgians felt that they were more similar to themselves and thus better, right? Well, when colonialism was over, as I showed you on the previous map, 1950s and 60s is when a lot of countries' hard-fought freedoms were finally gained, and they got their own independence and control over their own territories. Well, the majority group in Rwanda started a campaign of basically, again, demonizing this ethnic minority, very often on radio programs. They would really foment the local population to just literally go out and murder people of this different ethnicity. And it was a thing that started up small scale with individual skirmishes and whatnot, but it ramped up, and people just went with machetes and would just kill everybody of the other ethnicity that they would encounter. As I said before, up to 1 million died. Eventually, well, I should say, not all the Hutu were wanted to participate in this. Many of them defended the ethnic minorities whenever they could and didn't want to be a part of this. When it comes to something like genocide, well, it actually only takes a small actual number of people to actually commit giant atrocities. You don't need 1 million people to kill 1 million people. Well, after this genocide, a lot of the population moved to neighboring countries, not just the Tutsis, but the Hutu, who were not in favor of what was happening, and they all together regrouped and kind of reinvaded their country to demand equal rights. And there's been kind of a tense peace ever since. When we look at the 10 deadliest genocides of all time, if you're looking for kind of trends, many of these are very connected to colonialism. In empires, I should say, because a lot of these go to ancient times and before what we would kind of call colonialism. But all empires take over territory. All empires, when they take over territory, they steal the resources, because that's why they're taking over the territory. They also usually kill about half the population in any area that's taken over. And again, that's to take the resources of the people who were killed. They also take resources of people who were not killed. That's what empires do, right? All right. It's only relatively recently that there has been a bit of a resurgent, ethnic pride for different minority groups. There's always been a long-term resistance to the kind of dominant narratives of dominant groups. But it's only more recently, like I said, that a lot of minority groups around the world have kind of come together to pool resources and strategies, and have through time gotten a lot of different rights. And it really depends on the place and the time. So for example, Native Americans in the US, as well as, for example, the Aborigines in Australia and New Zealand have been using the courts to fight for rights, right? Because there are certain human rights that a lot of countries recognize. And so they're able to go through the courts to, sometimes get land back even. This happened actually in Australia. There's a big movement to give land back to indigenous populations. The attitude of a lot of Australians, the feeling that a lot of them were forced to move there. As you know, Australia, prison labor. And a lot of them feel like, well, give the land back because they don't care who it is they're paying their rent to. They're going to pay the rent either way. So why not give land back to the original populations? There's examples of, of people really embracing non-dominant cultures as a way of basically free expression, but also of kind of self-actualization. Well, the example of in Brazil, Japanese population who came to Brazil, and then in Brazil, well, people still thought of them as their ethnicity, right? As being Japanese and not truly Brazilian. When these populations moved back to Japan, they found themselves to be acting more Brazilian than they had in Brazil as a form of self-idealization. And since people were already treating them a bit like they were foreigners, right? Even though they're of Japanese descent. This picture of Brasilia is in our book, kind of talking about this section. It's interesting because this image, and I don't know if people know much about Brazil. It's kind of interesting because, Rio de Janeiro had for a long time been the capital of Brazil. Rio is a very popular city, great beaches. It's kind of where everyone liked to live. And in Brazil, there have been different political parties who think about the rainforest in different ways. There are some who want to preserve it as an international resource and heritage. There are others who feel like it should be cut down in similar way to much of the U.S. forest was chopped down and changed into developments. Well, the government in Brazil decided to switch where their capital was to something that's more in the center of the country, and that's smack dab in the middle of the rainforest. Well, not anymore, as you can see. They cut down a whole bunch and put in what they deemed to be a super ultra-modern city. Extremely planned as it comes to urban planning and design. But, there were some problems. One of the main problems is that when it was designed, because it was ultra modern and whatnot, there wasn't a lot of affordability in a country that a lot of the population is quite poor. Also, the design of Brasilia, because it was based on a lot of other countries' city designs, they didn't put in things like, they didn't put in much sidewalks. And most of the population couldn't afford a car, so it actually quickly became the capital of accidental cars driving into people, because if you only have the road to walk on, that's what you're going to walk on. Because that's on top of that in Brasilia. Again, it was made to be this kind of shiny modern example, but people who moved here to work couldn't afford to live in the center of the city. And so when we talk about shanty towns and temporary developments that are put up, those are actually eventually grew up around a ring around the city itself. And because in Brazil, wealth and poverty is often racialized, it's the lighter complected individuals who are in the center and the darker complected individuals who are in that outlying area. So it's kind of, is not what they had designed it to be, because they didn't take a lot into context. Each chapter has a section on nature, culture. This chapter being ethnicity and race. It looks at environmental racism. And that manifests in lots of different ways. One of the classic examples, of course, in the US is Native Americans forced to live on basically the least productive land, right? And what happens worldwide, this happens to a lot of ethnic minorities, where they're pushed into the worst land to utilize. And then what this does is, well, if you're on the worst land, you can't get any resources out of it, well, you're not going to be a prosperous people. And then that lends itself to the discourse that the majority group is trying to paint in that country, which is that other group are just not productive as a people when they're given the worst resources, right? And again, it's these narratives that different places try to create. When it comes to environmental racism within the US, and this is a topic that's really big in geography, environmental racism, but when you look at places, well, you see toxic release facility overlap a map of minority population, right? And you see these are highly correlated. Not only is it the poorest land, but it's also very often these polluted areas are very central. Usually when central cities kind of want to develop, especially in our kind of post-industrial age when a lot of manufacturing went out of business, well, you have these what are called brownfield sites. Brownfield as opposed to greenfield. A greenfield site is, if you have a farm and you decide to change it into suburbs. Brownfield site is just an old urban area, maybe manufacturing of some kind. But what happens, well, if you're going to redevelop it in an environmentally sustainable way, that actually costs a lot of money because you got to process all the soils. Very often these companies go out of business and they have no record of kind of what chemicals they had on their land, and so you actually have to have someone go out and do a whole bunch of measurements and soil samples to see what kind of pollutants even there are to even find out. Like I said, especially these older businesses that have might have been out of business for 50 years, and it could just be a vacant area of land that maybe you drive by and just kind of note sometimes. So when you do see these redeveloped, like I said, it's extra cost to redeveloping brownfield sites compared to greenfield sites. So sometimes there'll be just housing and whatnot that is adjacent to it, and they don't even fully know kind of what the pollutants are there. Again, these are both images from our book looking at environmental racism. The image on the left is in Delhi, and it's the Islamic populations who are living in basically a garbage dump area. And it's interesting how this changes through where you go, right? So that would be in India, where the Islamic population is an oppressed minority. If you go to Egypt, the Coptic Christians very often live in the actual garbage dumps, and the only way that they can kind of sustain themselves is by trying to, well, very often they do a lot of recycling, right? Because you have to live in the garbage dump anyway. But again, environmental racism. Let's see, a couple other terms from this chapter. Cultural pre-adaptation. And then again, this is still on that kind of nature culture topic within this chapter. But what that means is, well, very often you'll have a population that will want to move to a place that is environmentally similar to where they had come from. My Scandinavian ancestors were told that, Minnesota is a lot like Scandinavia because it gets snow and whatnot. It, of course, gets much colder here than it does in Scandinavia, but suckered my ancestors into coming here. So, that happens with lots of places around the world, right? The examples from the book are Cubans who live in southern Florida because, well, you have similar fishing, you have similar vegetation farming, right? Vietnamese in the Gulf of Mexico, very same thing. Bantu in Africa, very same thing. You also have cultural maladaptation, right? The other side of this. That is, well, when a culture, well, I'll use an example of Eurocentrism in Africa. During colonialism, many Europeans, when they went to Africa and attempted to settle, they often found themselves riddled with tropical diseases. This is for a couple different reasons. One is they weren't living like the Africans lived, who had lived in a place where they knew how to deal with these different diseases. So, for example, Europeans usually live by a river, right? It's a way to move things, a source of water. Well, the Africans in Africa knew that is malaria, right? You got mosquitoes all over, other tropical diseases. Europeans also brought their crops from Europe, which were not made for Africa. Even things like the farming techniques of using a plow and plowing up land. Well, if it's an area that gets a lot of rain, especially seasonal rain, you plow up the land and you put in your seed, and it could all just be washed out like the next day. So maladaptation, again, when people are using something from their own environment in the new environment, and it just is not working. It's the wrong strategy. Another term in this chapter, cultural simplification. I would say, well, cultural simplification is very much what it sounds like. You could have a group, let's say it's an immigrant group who come to the U.S., and they'll lose a lot of aspects of their culture, but maybe keep some residual ones. So, for example, if someone said that they're, anyone here Irish at all? A little Irish? Yeah. People in the U.S., when they say they're Irish, they usually don't know that much about Ireland, right? They know vaguely a couple Irish things, and that's kind of it, right? The part of that culture that is left is very simplified. I know this is tough to read. I might have to read this. This is an example of when you talk about racialization and majority group discourses trying to paint a specific picture of minority groups. This is actually a quote from a book talking about the Irish in 1891. There's a lot of anti-Irish sentiment in the time. Like I said, it's a photocopy, so it's not the best written. I'm trying to think if I'm going to give it a try to read it to you. The tenement house and its life have done effectual work, and one that goes on day by day. It is here that we must seek for the mass of the poor. It is here that we find the cases which combined are making of the generation now coming up a terror in the present and a promise of future evil beyond man's power to reckon. They are a class apart, the poor Irish forming by far the larger portion. They retain all the most brutal characteristics of the Irish peasant at home, but without the redeeming light-heartedness and tender impulses and strong affections of that most perplexing people. Sullen, malicious, conscienceless, with no capacity for enjoyment, save in drink and the lowest forms of debauchery, they are filling our prisons and reformatories, marching in an ever-increasing army through the quiet country and making a reign of terror wherever their foots are heard. With little added intelligence, they become socialists and do their hardest to ruin the institutions by which they live. Like I said, this is the type of discourses that dominant groups put out of non-dominant groups, and this was a time when the Irish were that in the U.S. And again, there were popular books and novels and stories that people read in the newspapers and stuff that painted this picture. Again, staying on the nature culture subtopic in this chapter, we've talked before about how natural land forms can protect different groups. I actually have a feeling that one of the authors of this book was really fascinated with the Caucasus region because they've come back to it again and again with kind of different maps looking at the different ethnicities in the area. As you can see there, well, they go over the borders of different countries, right? Different ethnicities. This is another area where, we talk about the Russians and the former Soviet Union, but this is another area where they came into play as far as attempts to have all these groups assimilated into their dominant culture. It's ironic that this is the Caucasus region because that's, of course, where the term Caucasian came from. Although, while the term is very old and it actually doesn't make a lot of sense, there's no specific Caucasian group of people who came from this area. This area has always been actually very diverse populations, and none that are especially what one might call Caucasian. Some other examples of environmental racism. And I will say, students very often do papers on this if this is a topic that you find of interest. Well, we talked about minorities near things like toxic dumps, farm workers exposed to pesticides, minorities and poor residing in contaminated buildings, especially lead. Lead has kind of been in the news a lot lately because they've started to kind of map the history of lead poisoning because it does cause a number of different cognitive problems. We've talked about Native Americans on bad land. They also were specifically targeted for nuclear waste dumping on their land. The government would sometimes offer some small amount of money, other times just say they didn't have a choice. Actually, there's been quite a bit of uranium that has been found on Native American land, and that was taken without any financial payback when the U.S. government needed those to make nuclear weapons. Talked about this example already a good bit. Like I said, this is Delhi in India, where the Hindu are the ethnic majority. I've actually been to this area, and there's just kind of a big garbage problem in India. They've kind of been talking about this culturally because it's something that is a bit of a norm, while Indian society, and we'll study this a lot more in our next chapter on religion, Indian society and the caste system, for example, have this strong emphasis on cleanliness versus non-cleanliness. That's why you'll see the ritualistic bathing and whatnot. But like I said, we'll get into that more next time. Here's a map showing another example of industrial air pollution in minority neighborhoods. As you can see, although they say correlation does not equal causation, it's highly correlated. Again, looking at the same data, but in a graph form, distance to these polluted areas and what percentage of the population is ethnic minorities. And the term environmental justice, right? That is the kind of modern attempt to look at these problems, look at how these things are correlated, look how the disempowered are forced to live in many different areas, right? Not just the U.S., but around the world. People are facing these same problems. Chapter also talks about the cultural landscape, as we've talked about many times. Cultural landscape is just the human imprint on the landscape. It could be seen in many different ways. In this chapter, because we're talking about ethnicity, talked about a lot of different ethnic flags that are on the landscape. And you know, it's one of those things where you might not even take it into account if you're driving around, or sometimes you do. You might be driving around and all of a sudden, you know, you're following your instructions on your Google Maps, and you'll be in an area, and it'll be an area maybe you've never seen, and you'll say, oh, there's things in different languages here and different foods, and might find it of note. But sometimes the ethnic flags are much more subtle than the obvious, you know, you've entered an area with different food. One of the examples on the left here, Amaze Greenery. Well, this is became a source of ethnic pride because of what it represents, more so than just a place to store corn. But specifically during colonialism, the in power Spanish preferred wheat over corn. But the indigenous populations kind of stuck to their cultural difference. And so by putting that out, even if they're not in use anymore, they're still symbolically saying a preservation of heritage over the larger colonial forces, all right? Let's see. Again, more kind of obvious cultural flags. Again, you've probably been driving out and you've seen a lot of different murals through places. Very often they could be complex depictions of different people from history of that specific ethnicity or culture. When I'm looking at this, I only recognize a few faces. People probably recognize Che Guevara in there. But other than that, I think that's Fidel Castro. So there are some things that you could pick up even if you don't have a huge amount of knowledge of a local culture. This is another one from the book. This one specifically is, you know, the raised fist denoting empowerment of this immigrant community, right? Very specific depiction. This is one of those more subtle examples, right? This is, well, a mortgage banker, as you could tell. You can see the lettering up top a little bit more. This is in Chinatown, but the red color, again, it's subtle, but that's sacred color in China. We also see in these cultural flags attempts to, at least at the small scale, replicate the landscapes of places that people are from, right? Even if, you know, if you go to like Lake Street over in Uptown, if you drive down it a while, you'll see buildings that are painted and done up in this way that are very similar to what you'd see for example, in Mexico, even though, you see a lot of these in the Southwest U.S. in general, and this coloring is meant to actually reflect sunlight so that a building doesn't heat up so much. And so you'll see these, of course, here where we're not actually that worried about the buildings overheating. But stylistically and whatnot, they'll use the same kind of template design because it's what's familiar, it's what reminds them of home, right? Again, remaking of places that are similar to what they would experience at their home. An actual surprisingly important concept in this chapter that kind of comes toward the end, iconoclasm. Well, what does that mean? In the landscape, right, symbolic things that represent cultures very often, if you have an empire coming in, they will usually attempt to destroy on the landscape anything that signifies that other culture that had power beforehand. And there's lots of examples of this worldwide. So, for example, you guys probably recognize like where this would come from, right? Where is this from? Yeah, but this is in the British Museum, right? I don't know if you get a chance to go to like the Louvre in France or the British Museum. There are these gigantic museums that are full of stuff that they just literally stole from other places. When I went to Egypt, you know, we'd be going around big sites and it'd be like, oh yeah, top of that statue, here's a picture of it, it's over in Italy. And here this big thing, well, you see how it's tore apart? You could go visit in France. Not a lot of repatriation of these things. When the Soviet Union fell, they had all these historical busts of, well, leadership that had been important to the Soviet Union. But a lot of countries, well, they didn't want those around anymore, right? And it kind of depend on different places and different countries. I think this picture is from Latvia or Lithuania. But they would just kind of take all the different ones that had been in various places throughout their country and just kind of put them all in a park so people can kind of go visit. This here is kind of became a bit infamous for a while when the Taliban took back parts of Afghanistan. You know, there are these old, ancient, 1,000-year-old statues that represented the Buddhist history in the region. And of course, the Taliban, well, any new conquering group that goes into an area, they rarely will preserve the ancient history. They'll instead destroy it. And so this was destroyed and blown up. And a lot of historians from around the world actually offered to remove it and take it to a museum. But the Taliban refused because they symbolically said they needed to represent the changeover in this area to their new regime. This one isn't in the book or anything. This is a picture I took when I was in Egypt because I thought it was a good example of, I don't know if you can tell, there's a bird sitting here, and the face of these are chipped out. If you see depictions that don't have their faces chipped out, usually because they were covered in sand historically for many years and were more recently dug up. Do people know who these are ancient Egyptian gods basically. Do people know who would be chipping off the faces of ancient Egyptian gods in Egypt? Yeah.
Would it be like people that didn't approve of them?
Yeah.
They would do it like as a way to defy them?
Yeah. What group was it that did it? Any guess? No. Usually students guess that it's the Islamic population who are the majority in Egypt current day today. But actually the Christians had Egypt for hundreds of years. And these were considered pagan gods. I don't know if you ever read a lot about the early church's view of paganism. But it's somewhat ironic that they chipped out the faces because the faces of the gods are all supposed to be carbon copies of each other because it's supposed to be a perfect being that would only have one look. And you actually tell the identity of the gods by their hats. That's the only way you can tell the difference. So if you ever see a lot of Egyptian stuff and they look really, really similar, know that that's on purpose. They're supposed to be perfect beings. All right. Iconoclasm. There's a slightly better picture of that bird in the chipped face. The book also talked about something that is a recent kind of thing that's been going on is removal of Confederate statues. Been in the news recently. There was worldwide actually an increase of removing statues of former slave owners in places like Britain and in European countries. There was not just minority populations whose ancestors had been enslaved, but modern day Europeans also found the idealization of these slave owners to be distasteful. And so there's been a great big surge of removing these. And similar to the Soviet Union removal, some places they go to museums, some places they're just destroyed and melted down. It really kind of depends. And people are still kind of count this as being controversial, right? There are those who feel like this is removing the history of the place. I would say people need to get used to this because the younger generation is just going to want to do more of that kind of thing, of removing tributes to, well, failed insurrection, right? All right. The foodways. The end of this chapter talks about, of course, how those are big cultural flags, right? Food and the way you prepare it, the way you present it, how they're connected to all kinds of specific cultural traditions. I actually thought this part of the book should have been a bit longer. It talks about some different examples of, like there's an example that they use talking about New Orleans, and after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of people moved out of the area because, well, it was a lot of flooding and it had a big economic hit. And a lot of the population who moved out didn't move back. But there was demand for jobs, and actually you had a surge of Hispanic people. And so it's a bit of a cultural flag if you saw a rise of things like taco trucks in the region. That's kind of one of the things that this chapter talks about as a cultural signifier involving food, showing a change of population in a place. Very often in different Chinatowns and different places around the world, you'll find more of a diverse range of food. Anyone been to China? My experience in China, their markets are way more diverse than the most diverse that you would see in a Chinatown in the US. I would say in their markets, just about anything that is edible, they have somewhere, and including many things that you would not think of as edible. Like when I was there, my guide insisted that we all have, they sell fried scorpions on a stick. Fried scorpions on a stick. Anyone ever eat an insect on purpose? They also have termites, which taste like mint, a little known fact that I found out, because they make you taste things when you go on trips. It was better than the scorpion on a stick. Scorpion on a stick was like, if you had some fried shrimp and you eat the wrong end, that is how I would describe that. Not the best. I think that a lot of the food is almost, if you go to places that have a history of starvation and big famines, they'll have a larger range of food that they still will utilize even after that has passed and there's plenty of food, but they'll still have developed different specific cuisines with those foods. Let me look here real quick. I think I'm going to leave us off at that. That is basically the conclusion of this chapter. Like I said, Friday, we're going to watch a video, the second episode of Guns, Germs, and Steel. I always do that before spring break because students often don't come to the Friday before spring break, and the video is online. So if you miss Friday and you need to watch it, you can, because it is online. But that's what we'll be doing Friday. I guess that's all. Class dismissed.